The low rumble of thunder and the flicker of lightning signifies the beginning of the stormy season in the Bane. Under the lash of heavy rain, the expeditionary forces either retire to their safety of their own territory or move into the fortresses they have captured. There they begin to rebuild, to strengthen their supply lines, and to call up reinforcements for the next stage of the campaign. Yes, today on Dragon's Teeth, we're looking at the end of Phase 1 in the Bane Wars campaign. Hi, I'm Rob Poyton. So yes, we've finished Phase 1 of the Bane Wars campaign. 24 moves, each movement represents a week, so we've had in effect 6 months of campaigning. Now the stormy season has hit. It's very difficult to move even individual units, let alone armies. So it's time for those expeditionary forces to report back to base, to take back any artifacts they may have discovered for further examination, and of course to consolidate any positions they may have captured. Just a quick reminder of the setup of the Bane. The Bane is a huge area at the centre of the continent, conveniently hex-shaped, and around its borders we have a number of other tribes. It's called the Bane because generations ago this was the site of a huge war, a number of major battles, and one or perhaps both sides, in order to win that battle, unleashed powerful magic. However, that magic, while it may or may not have won the battle, totally devastated the entire area. So for generations, no one has gone into the Bane because it's seen as like a dead zone. No one really knows what's there. However, the clans involved in those battles that retreated back into their homelands have of course grown over time. They need new resources, so they have each sent an expeditionary force out into the Bane to see what they could discover. As well as that exploration for resources and the like, each of the forces of course had their own unique objectives to meet as well, but we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. We had 5 commanders taking part in Phase 1, each with their own expeditionary force. We had Terry commanding the Human Brotherhood of the Bear Clan. We had Steve with the Elves, the Fire of Dragons. We had Mark with the Red Wolves, they were the Orc forces. We had Matt with the High Elf army, and I took on the role as a commander of the Legion of the Dead, the vampires. So the first thing I want to say is thanks to each of those players for taking part, and also thanks to everyone who wrote in with comments and suggestions as well. This is the first campaign I've run for, well, some considerable time, and it's the first one I've run really of this nature. Before I've run naval campaigns or small World War II campaigns. So it was a steep learning curve for me, and yes, I did learn some things, and of course some things work well, some things maybe not so well, so there's plenty to tweak as we move ahead. So as I mentioned, each of those clans or tribes or nations has a border that borders onto the Bane area. So what the commanders would do once a week was send me orders for their forces, simple direction, number of hexes they're moving, and I would send them back a map, tell them about anything they've discovered. It could be they've found an abandoned village, an old wizard's tower, and other things. They'd report back what they wanted to do, did they want to explore, and so on. Of course, at some point, armies and forces are going to come into contact with each other, so there we get negotiations or parleys being set up with the potential, of course, for conflict. As well as all that, I mentioned those specific objectives as well. And this was great because this was where the players really came into their own. They each came up with their own objectives, which as a game master was excellent because some of those ideas were better than things I could think up. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about those objectives because, of course, the game is still ongoing. And, of course, should I maybe sometime in the future rerun this phase of the exploration game, then, I want to keep those objectives fairly quiet. But let's just say that some were very successful and some forces less so in meeting those objectives. The first issue that arose were a couple of misunderstandings about the nature of the campaign and what it was going to involve. I know a couple of the players are seasoned campaigners, and a couple maybe have not taken part in this type of campaign before. I thought I'd made everything quite clear. I sent out a little pack of 4 or 5 sides of A4 explaining the background and explaining what was going to happen. However, maybe I could have made some things clearer, because one player thought that this was going to be a sort of player battle every week, a little bit like a sort of league table or tournament type setup. Consequently, as we got into the game, he found that he didn't really have the time required to send in orders, so he didn't really engage too much with the game. And in effect, I was almost running his army at one point as my own, which was a little bit tricky, but I'll come on to that as well. One of the other players didn't quite get the scale of the map or the size of the playing area, and consequently spent quite a lot of time just on the one A4 map, going around and carefully mapping out everything, thinking that this was the major part of the area for exploration, when in fact, I think at one point that player said to me, "Oh, I must be halfway across the Bane by now." I said, "No, you're not. You maybe not even a quarter of the way in." So, having learnt that, then he started exploring and spreading out a little further in the later turns. By contrast, the two other players, the Fire Elves in particular, really set out exploring with a vengeance. I think at one point with the Fire Elves, I was sending back 3 separate maps. That expeditionary force split into 3 as they came across the border. One went this way, one went this way, one went that way, and they discovered tons of stuff. Unfortunately, they didn't quite get their objective, but they do get a lot of points for exploring, for discovering a lot of other things, and actually, as it turns out, probably ending up in the strongest position out of all the sides. The Brotherhood of the Bear Clan also did very well. They got very much into the exploration. They kept their units in a little tighter, didn't kind of roam around so much, but were very thorough and explored everything they found and made some contacts with other forces and NPC characters, I suppose you'd call them, because although the Bane is seen as a desolate wasteland, there are things and people living there. Some of these were friendly. So I think, for example, the Brotherhood of the Bear found a clan of centaurs in a forest. They tried to make an alliance with them. The centaurs, as it turns out, weren't that interested, but they remained friendly. They allowed the humans to pass through their territory. In other places, the locals weren't so happy to see outsiders. Well, in other places, some of those locals were things like giant spiders, right? You don't negotiate with giant spiders. The Fire Elves actually encountered 2 other NPC clans. They went all the way down to the south of the Bane, where they discovered a fortress that was home to a group of rather mysterious humans. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail about that. And pretty much in the centre of the Bane, they discovered a large dwarven mining operation. So that became largely the focus for the Fire Elves. It wasn't actually part of their objective, but they did discover this mine that was mining a wonderful metal called mithrium, which, amongst other things, is fire resistant and makes very good shields and armour. The Orcs, meanwhile, they did eventually catch up with the others and they came down into the central area of the Bane. Now, how I did these objectives, let's say, for example, we had a clan of hobbits and their objective was to find the sacred orb of Bilbo or something like that. So that's their objectives. That orb is somewhere in the Bane, and I just basically put it somewhere random. I'd roll a dice, and that's where that artifact is going to be. So that's what happened for all the objectives. As it turned out for the Bear Clan, that worked out quite well because their objective was fairly close. It was in their sort of quadrant of the map, if you like. So I think within about 10 turns or so, maybe a little bit more, they discovered their objective. They explored it. Of course, they had a little contretemps with some locals and the orcs as well, who were coming down into the same area. But they got their area secured very quickly and found lots of useful artifacts. Now, the irony of the orcs is once they started moving and getting down into the centre of the Bane, they actually discovered three objectives, their own and the objectives of two other players, including the Bear Clan. And actually the other one was the Undead, the Vampire Clan. They discovered the location of the artifacts that the vampires were looking for. However, they seem to be a bit nervous, these orcs. So the vampire artifact was in an abandoned city in a big old crypt. The orcs discovered it and didn't want to open it, so they left it. Likewise, they actually discovered the Bear Clan's objective and area, which was this sort of area of standing stones all covered in mist and fog. And again, they were too nervous to go in, so they came away from it. In effect, they could have had the objectives of two of the other players in their possession, but they chose not to. Now, as it turned out, the artifact that the orcs were looking for was in the possession of those dwarves, because the dwarves are coming to the Bane, they're running this mining operation, they find an old orc tomb, and they discover the artifact. So the dwarves had the orcs' artifact. At one point, the orcs and the dwarves got into a battle. Basically, the fire elves invaded the mining area, pushed the dwarves out. They retreated out to the north, where unfortunately they met the orc army coming south. Battle ensued, which we put up as a report, and the dwarves ended up surrendering. Half of them were slaughtered and the rest surrendered. The dwarven leader actually had the orc artifact on his possession, but again, rather mysteriously, the orcs decided just to let all the dwarves go. So all those surviving dwarves promptly said, "Oh, thanks, mate," and promptly fled with that artifact. Now, it didn't do the dwarves much good because they fled to the east, I think. They couldn't go south because the elves were there. We've got the orcs to the north. The Brotherhood of the Bear are somewhere over to the west. They fled east. Guess who was waiting for them there? Yes, the vampires. So the vampires not only ended up with some very nice new dwarf zombie units, they also ended up with the orc artifact as well. They later traded this with the orcs as part of a sort of deal. Well, it was sort of an alliance, but it really didn't last long because it seems that you can't trust a vampire when it comes to alliances. Now, there weren't quite as many battles as I might have expected. This was for a few reasons, I think. First of all, this is an exploration phase. These are expeditionary forces. So although they were 1,000 points in terms of our Fantastic Battles rule set that we've been using throughout, which are the great set of rules for 10 mil fantasy battles, best set of rules we've found. So a 1,000 point army, it's a fair size, but it's not a huge army. And of course, a significant amount of that force is going to be light cavalry and scouts and flyers and that sort of thing. You've got to keep your lines of communication open. There's also that issue of two players really moving around the map a lot, one player moving around part of the map and the other one just heading in a straight line pretty much away from everyone else as it turned out. So that meant that two of the forces didn't really get into that central area very early on. If they had done, I think we'd have had a few more battles. And certainly right near the very end, in the last few turns, we did get pretty much all the forces with one of sort of map area. The area was divided. I think there's about 12 maps that make up the whole Bane. They were all pretty much on one page. So a huge battle could have gone on at the end there, which would have been interesting. But, well, a couple of things happened, and again, without that input from one commander, I didn't want to commit his forces without him saying so. We did get some battles in though. There was violence, mainly around that dwarven mining operation. We had the elves attack. We had the elves had to break in through the fortress wall at the front of the mining operation. They cleared that out. Most of the dwarves fled north. Some fled south. The elves there discovered a dwarven fortress, so they laid siege to that. There was another battle there. We had the other fight between the orcs and the escaping dwarves to the north that I mentioned. And the last battle was this meeting between the orcs and the Bear Clan humans. What happened was, as the orcs pressed further south, as the Bear Clan humans came across, they discovered the orc supply line, so they started taking out the supply posts. Obviously, this is an issue for any army on the move. If you're not getting food coming through, you're not getting reinforcements coming through, that needs to get sorted. And that ended up with a pitched battle between the orcs and the humans, with the vampires kind of hanging around, but as it turned out, pulling away at the last moment. And there was also an appearance from the Fire Elves dragon, who decided to attack the orc baggage train and nick all the stuff that they're taken from the dwarves. So I do feel a bit sorry for the orcs. They did sort of get it from both sides in that situation. So, if you like, the final scores at the end of the day were the orcs recovered their artifact, but suffered a bit of a defeat. I mean, they didn't lose their whole army, but they probably lost about half of their force. But they got their artifact and they've retreated back up to the mountains, back to their homeland. The Brotherhood of the Bear discovered their objective and their artifacts. They've also got a nice fortress next to that, which they're in the process of rebuilding. The Fire Elves didn't discover their main objective, but they have taken over this big mining operation. They've also got a fortress there. They've made contact with some other people down south. They also discovered another ruined city down to the south as well. They moved into that to have a look, but that was the place where the big spiders live, and I mean big spiders. They gave that a miss for the moment to concentrate on the dwarves. I'm sure in the future they'll be going back to that city to have a proper look around. The vampires also discovered their artifact, as I mentioned, in that other ruined city to the north, so they're now occupying that space, consolidating that position. And each of these spaces is within, a sort of week or so's march of each other. So there's the potential there in the next stage, no doubt, for some more conflict, perhaps some more skullduggery. Now, speaking of skullduggery, one thing that I brought in as we went along were the espionage rules as well. So players could allocate a certain amount of gold pieces into espionage or counter espionage. They had some gold pieces to start. They were also discovering gold pieces when they, go and look in an old village or in the cities or that sort of thing. There's treasure laying around. So the espionage will be directed at another player, and they needed to specify which player they were looking at and whether it was going to be like a scouting mission, a spying mission, an assassination attempt. We had also a nice one was an attempt to spread misinformation and discord amongst an enemy group. That worked very well on one particular occasion. And of course, counter espionage was just an attempt to counter any of those things that might be happening to your army. Now, obviously, as the game master, if you like, and one of the commanders, I had a godlike view of everything that was going on. I tried not to let that influence my own decisions with what my army was doing. So there were two ways that I got around that. One, in some cases, I use random movement for my forces. I rolled a dice and that would tell me which way they were going. The second thing was I allocated a lot of money, almost all the vampire money went on espionage in terms of spying and scouting. So that's basically how I rationalized having all this information as a player, was through my great network of spies. Because actually, when I was thinking about this, if you want to put a spy into the dwarf army, well, it's pretty much got to be a dwarf, isn't it? It's difficult to put a 6'8" elf in a dwarf army with, you know, sort of horned helmet, perhaps a fake beard. Is sort of doing this. The advantage with the vampires is you can turn anything into a vampire, right? So you can have vampire dwarves and vampire elves. So their spying network was very good. That's how I justified it anyway. The other interesting thing that started to come up were these little plot twists and turns, because this is a very much a narrative based game. So we had that communication going on between a lot of the players. They were coming up with a lot of great ideas and names for their characters as well. Some great naming. And we started to get into this area where the elves and the vampires had never met. At one point they do, and the elves are kind of struck by how elvish the vampires look. So I thought, there's an interesting twist. Perhaps these at some point, you know, were part of the same group. Perhaps they've got a common ancestry. That's an interesting thing to explore as we go on into the next stage of the campaign. Speaking of which, looking ahead to phase 2, now that initial exploration is over, now we can get into the serious business of conquest. So it could be that one clan wants those resources that another one has got. That dwarven mining operation, for example, in the middle, you know, a lot of people are going to have their eye on that. So that's going to be the setting for the next phase, which we're going to start up in a few weeks' time. It's going to be run along exactly the same lines, because I was pleased to see that the basic structure and the running of the game worked very well. There were a couple of minor tweaks here and there, but the game mechanics seem to work very well. So that's something I'm considering putting together as a sort of settings book, a guide to running a fantasy campaign perhaps. I might get all that out and published at some point in the future, along with, as I've mentioned, because the narrative took many excellent turns and proved to be so strong, I'm going to be putting out some novellas as well based on this setting. So keep an eye out for those next year. But yeah, the next stage of the campaign, we've got the Brotherhood of the Bear, we've got the Fire Elves, and we've got the Vampires are still going to be continuing. That means we've got space for a few other players. So it's going to be run along the same lines. Players send in their orders once a week. They get a report back. They can respond to that. Any meetings with hostile or friendly forces, there's a negotiation phase. And then if we need to, we can move to the tabletop to resolve any battles. Or sometimes what I did, if it was a small skirmish, I played it out here at home with the various figures. I think that attack on the mine I actually did with my old 28mm figures. So battles can be resolved in a few different ways. If this whole thing has captured your interest and it's something you'd like to be involved in, then drop me a line at dragoteeth@outlook.com or leave me a message down below. We have places open for probably another 3 players. One will have to be dwarves. Will they get their revenge? We've got that mysterious human tribe to the south. Think sort of ancient Egyptian with a little bit of a twist, and you get there. And we've got the orcs. Someone can take over the orcs. And we've got another slot. I'm just thinking of the spaces around the hex. We can get another 1 or maybe even 2 armies in as well. So that could be something of your choice. It could be elf or hobbit or dwarf or human or lizard men, or anything you can come up with fits. Because this is not a specific setting as such. It also means that your elves, as we had with one example with the high elves, don't have to be the nice elves of sort of Middle Earth. They could be really nasty evil elves. You know, you can put your own spin on whatever force you decide to have. And of course, the Fantastic Battles rule set allows you to do this because in effect, you make your army to measure. There's so much tweaking you can do. You really get your own personalised army to play with. So that's about it. That's our wrap up of phase 1, season 1. It might make quite a good TV series, that, you know, they could put it on Amazon. To be honest, I think it might be better than some other fantasy series on Amazon, but let's not get into that right now. If you are interested, then do drop me a line and let me know. I'll get all the information out to you. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, always glad to hear them. As I say, I had some great suggestions coming in on the rules, some great ideas there, so do keep those coming. And a big thanks again to all the players who took part. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did, and I'm looking forward to the next round. See you soon.